Hi, welcome to the Shepherd's Rest Doc Talk. This is episode 212. I am Cam. This is Plant. We're going to pick up just from a few things that were not discussed on the Friday chats, number 6. And we did talk about it once the camera was off, one or two things, but I wanted to just put it out there so it was documented and there for the taking for, I don't know, whenever in the history of time that someone chooses to want to look at this. So here it is. I wanted to first talk about Luke 9, and that would be verses 56 to 62. This is where three situations where people come up and they say, I want to follow you, Lord. Whatever I can, Jesus, I want to follow you. So let's look at verse 57. It says, and it came to be as they journeyed on their way that someone said to him, Master, I shall follow you wherever you go. And Yeshua said to them, the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So this is one that really, when we go back and let the Old Testament define these things, we know that foxes comes to mean false teachers. And birds are the evil ones, right? So we've got our false prophets, So it's false prophets and false teachers. Birds are teachers, the foxes are prophets. We even have Luke 13, I think it's 32, is where, it's interesting, Jesus says to go tell Herodias and calls her a fox. Because again, she's spreading the wrong stuff, right? She's speaking against Messiah. And so it just also goes into, there's a fox. There's someone who has earthly dominion, but not heavenly. The foxes have earthly. The birds, we know in Matthew 13, are being used as the evil ones. I always think of black crows for whatever reason. Whenever I read these, I'm like, those black crows. So then when I see them in the parking lot of Walmart, I go, ooh, which actually there's nothing wrong with the crow. But anyhow, I digress. So here we have the foxes that are in the ground and the birds that are in the heavens. These are things, remember, that Hasatan, Satan, is Lord of the air, right? And of the earth per se at the time, temporarily. And so Messiah is basically saying, look, you want to follow me, but where I have, there is no place on earth at this point that I'm all comfy. It's going to be uncomfortable. This journey is uncomfortable because my kingdom is a heavenly kingdom. And not until that heavenly kingdom comes will we really have that sense of being settled and at home. So there's the one quote or lesson about can I follow you. The second one is in verse 59, where someone else says, it says, and he said to another, follow me. But he said, Master, let me first go and bury my father. So let's talk about this, because Messiah's response is, let the dead bury their own dead. Well, he's not saying, who cares, he's dead, leave him alone. That would go against Torah. Torah is to honor your mother and father. That requires burying them. That requires being there. But there was said to be a pattern that they would put them in the grave for 1 year. Then after a year, they would go and collect their bones, little bone collector, then take their bones, put them in a box, and then put them with the family tomb. So that's why you have archaeologists who find all like a room or a grave that has all these boxes of bones in them. And outside of the box are marked down who they are. They're like little coffins, okay? Because they didn't do coffins like that. They did little spaces for their bodies basically to deteriorate. So then they could move them into these boxes. So Messiah isn't saying, have nothing to do with your family. What Messiah is saying is, do not be involved with let's back up. Do not put the traditions of men above the call for your life. So where Messiah says, come follow me, and the guy's like, well, let me finish this business here I have on earth with the earthly. And Messiah's like, you've done the things that are required, and by that, I don't mean basic requirement. I mean that are loving your family. These are things that are just going to hold you there waiting for tradition of man. No, come follow me now. Don't wait. Then the third one is kind of still on that same line of thinking. It's verse 60 and 61. And another said, Master, I shall follow you, but let me first go say goodbye to my house. But Yeshua said to him, no one having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God. So basically, I immediately think of the whole idea of Lot's wife, right? Don't look back. She looks back and she's no good now. Pillar of salt. So this idea is, if we think about Genesis 24, where Rebecca is, let's go, and Rebecca goes back, talks to her family. They're like, just stay 10 more days. Just stay a while with us. And she says, no, I'm going now. They wanted to hold her. And that's his whole day. You go tell the family, and your family's going to want to try to hold you back so that you can't go. They don't want to let you go. That's not their thing. They want to hold you, right? So of these, we have the traditions of men being held higher than following the Lord. And that's what he's saying you can't do. You have to be able to give up, die to your flesh to follow me in order to have a role and even define the kingdom of heaven. All right, the next thing I want to talk about was the storm idea that we talked about. The storm, it can be found in Luke 9, and we're going to, not Luke 9, I'm going back to what we just talked about, is in Mark 6, and I'm going to go there. It's also in Matthew 14, but we're going to follow the Mark 6. This is found in verse 45 to 52. This is the storm. Okay, they've already fed the 5,000. The 5,000 are fed. And now Messiah takes them. Let's go. Remember, they've been excited about what they've been able to do out ministering. They come back. The Lord's like, okay, now let's feed. All right, let me show you how you're going to be feeding my people, the sheep. And then he takes them to let them rest. All right. He says, you guys go ahead. He sends them out. He stays behind. He dismisses the people. Then he goes and he prays. He prays up on a mountain. And then he sees the boat. Now, what I love about this is it makes the comment that he remained on land. And that's in verse 47. It says, and when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea. That's where the disciples are. And he was alone on the land. And seeing them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night. So that's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. That's the last watch. The last watch before daybreak. So they're holding on. They're working hard. Now think about this. They've been out there for a while. I mean, the Lord didn't send them out at 1 in the morning and dismiss the crowds, right? It was probably daylight still. So they've been out there for a while in the middle of the Lake of Galilee or Sea of Galilee, and they're rowing and they're fighting this wind, okay? And it's believed that their fear of this wind or this storm was because they were Galilean fishermen. They knew the storm, that this had a sense of a demonic, like taking them over. And again, I go back to the fourth hour, right? It's always darkest before dawn, that they are just fighting this. And another reason why I suggest that there's this demonic understanding is that when Messiah, who's watching them, he's watching them from the land. He's watching them, and then he goes out. And when he goes to walk out, they see him and they freak out. They think he's a phantom, right? They think he's a ghost, some sort of demonic being or a spiritual being for sure, walking on the water. And what's interesting is in verse 48, it says, at the fourth watch, then go down. He came to them walking on the sea, and he wished to pass by them. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought he was a phantom and cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. So basically he said, I am. All right, the same thing he said to Abraham, the same thing he said to Moses, the same thing he said to Joshua. I am. Okay, he's letting them know, living God's here with you, right? And so it says, then he went up into the boat, and the wind ceased, and they were exceedingly amazed in themselves, and marveled. So I find it interesting that Messiah wanted to walk past. His goal was to walk past, because they were going to be able to have the action and faith and understanding that they were in his hands. He's watching, but it doesn't require him to stop. But they're afraid when they see him. Their reaction, they don't know what to do. And so when they do this, he says, hey, I'm with you. Don't be afraid, right? And then, again, it makes me think of Jonah, because once he is aware, or they talk about, for lack of a better word, they talk about the storm, right? they're afraid, and he acknowledges that, the storm ceased. Same thing with Jonah. Once he said, just throw me over, and he did, the storm ceased, right? So again, just a connection that I always like to throw out there. He's, again, like Jonah. But there are scriptures that foreshadow that this is something Messiah will do, is that calming the storm. And that's in Psalms 107, 23 to 30. John 6:19-21 covers the storm idea also. I don't know. It's just verses that I kind of feel like tie into this that, I don't know. Anyway, just give you those scriptures. If you want to go read them and see how they might tie in, that's great. All right, so this storm, this is also the storm that in Matthew 14, we see that Peter comes out and walks on the water. It's interesting, Mark doesn't talk about that. He's a servant. He doesn't talk about that because as a servant, people aren't necessarily, they're following, but it's a different role versus the book of Matthew, who's talking about him being a king, right? So his subjects are taking on his authority to walk on the water as well. But then he gets scared, right? And Yeshua says, oh, you have little faith. Why didn't you believe? What's believe mean? Believe means hearing and doing. So by that suggestion of believing, it's not like this. It's hearing and doing. I would suggest that he stopped walking when he sank. Something happened. Messiah's walking, he's walking, and something happens. He stops in that action. The stopping of that action is what proved what was happening down on the inside, which was, I can't do this. What am I doing? I can't do this. And in it, he stopped. And then he sinks. And you notice Messiah grabs him up. And I always think about, so did Messiah just like walk on it and just grab him up, by the scruff of the neck and put him back in the boat? Did he carry him? Was he instantly and then they were in the boat? And I don't know this thing. Or did he grab him, hold him, and walk him back? With his help, did Peter walk back and get into the boat like he walked out? How many steps did he go? Did he go far? Did he just stand there for a second? These are things we don't know, things that we can toss around in our head. But again, I find it interesting. We have two events. When they're in the boat, they cry out to the Lord. They cry out to him, and he says, don't worry, don't be afraid. And then Peter comes out, and then he cries out again and says, save me. So we have a group and an individual event happening there in both situations. And in both situations, the Lord calms the storm for them and brings them safely on their mission. Oh, yeah, and there's one more thing about that storm that I find fascinating. And it's in verse, Verse 51, and it says, and he went up to them into the boat, okay, and the wind ceased, and they were exceedingly amazed in themselves and marveled, 52. For they did not understand about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. Why is that mentioned right after the storm? Again, this says, okay, did something happen at the feeding? We talked about this last week on the Friday night chat. Did something happen at that feeding in their hearts and because of that, this storm comes to make them stop and think, make them stop and reconsider. I don't know what it is they're reconsidering, but I definitely believe that the fact that their hearts were hardened about the bread and not understanding that they were put in the position of having this storm come up. In other words, it opened the gateway for this storm to swell around them. But remember, Messiah never took his eyes off of them. He was always there with them. And he answered when called upon. But he could have also gone by and they would have still been safe and brought to him safely. So yeah, I didn't want to forget that about the bread because that was amazing. All right, so the last thing was, speaking of the bread, I want to talk really quick about the leaven of the bread. So Messiah says to them, let's see, it's actually in Luke 12. That's the quickest one to find. Luke 12, 1 and 2. Verse 1 says, meanwhile, when the innumerable crowd of people had gathered together so that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his taught ones, first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. And whatever is concealed shall be revealed, and whatever is hidden shall be known. So whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and whatever you have spoken in the ear in the inner rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. But I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, and after who are unable to do anymore. So basically, this leadership, he's like, don't listen to the leadership. Beware of their leaven, that false doctrine. All right. Remember, we had the foxes and we have the birds. We have the false doctrine that's out there. He's like, beware of that. See, I think maybe a part of the idea of not understanding the bread was they had a lot of the leaven. They had a lot of the misunderstandings of the earthly and having a hard time to let go of that for the heavenly. Just a thought process. Again, it's not in black and white, but it's the process of learning those patterns. So I really think that the hypocrisy that he's saying, be careful. Because in Luke, for this week's Torah portion, we go from Luke 10 to Luke 15, 16, but we'll probably just talk about to 15. But anyway, we see this pattern, this whole thing going on that's like, okay, this is what I taught you, disciples, and this is what they're teaching. And it's this constant between the two teachings. And the Lord is basically cleansing or dividing out his house, right? Pulling those two apart, causing enmity between them. And you notice the Pharisees who don't choose to follow after Messiah are against him. I mean, they're not like, well, don't worry about him. They're like, no, we want to kill him, right? So the ones that he's speaking of this week, we'll see the woe to you, right? Those guys are really out to get him because it becomes two doctrines and those doctrines clash. So Messiah is saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the false doctrine, the doctrine that says oral tradition is greater than the living word. The doctrine that says, don't worry about the living word. Don't worry about that. That's all old news. Here's the way it should be. Beware of that. Always go back to the living word. Let that be the root. Let the Holy Spirit teach us in that. Don't let man teach us in the doctrine of man. Let the Holy Spirit teach us in the doctrine of God. So anyway, those are the things I just wanted to touch on really quick. And I hope you guys have a fantastic day, a great evening, Shabbat Shalom. And we hope to get the Friday chat number 7 out to you, before the weekend is over. So I should say before the first of the week, which would be Sunday, which brings in Hanukkah. We're so excited. So you guys have a great night. Shabbat Shalom.